What then is the approach of the warrior, if that is another term for somebody who is on the Toltec approach to life?
Yes, it's become traditional, or at least it's always been traditional, that people who are following the Toltec teachings are termed to be warriors, and hence the warrior's path. But really, this is not a military warrior that we're talking about. It's a warrior of the spirit. In other words, someone who is really fighting to gain knowledge, but true knowledge, not just information, true knowledge of the self, whether male or female. And that is what we call a warrior, and hence the warrior's path, which has become associated, and indeed is part of what we call the Toltec way.
We often hear it referred to as a path with a heart.
Yes.
How does that actually connect then with being a warrior? If we're talking heart and warrior in the same sentence.
Yes, yes. Well, as I said just now, a warrior is not a military being. If I could just maybe take it from a different angle first, before answering your question, you must realize that as human beings, we operate with two principal functions. We have what is called the thinking, rational principle, which is the mind. And then we have the feeling, intuitive principle, which we call the heart. Upon the warrior's path, or within the Toltec teachings, we are taught both principles, because in fact both principles make up our totality, the totality of the self. The way of the mind, or the rational thinking principle, we term the right side, and the feeling, intuitive side, we term the left side, or the heart. But when we refer to a path with the heart, it is because that's the ultimate goal. We can't just be thinking rational beings. We also have to feel, and we also have to be able to intuit life. And therefore, the aim upon the warrior's path is to start the apprentice off on coming to grips with how the thinking principle, or the mind, really works, and how it can be made to serve the real purpose of why we are on this planet. Once that much is achieved, it then becomes relatively easy to start understanding what the real feeling or intuitive approach is. And this might make more sense to you if we just look at where the world is at basically today. If one looks at the scientific fraternity as an example, or even the medical fraternity, generally speaking, feelings and intuition are scoffed at because it's regarded as being airy-fairy nonsense. But really, that is a great tragedy, because our feeling, intuitive side, although it is irrational and therefore very hard to understand, is truly our true essence. It's what really makes our lives into something which has great meaning, or something which is quite an empty intellectual process. And that is why I said just now, upon the warrior's path, the apprentice is trained to go from mind to heart. And ultimately, it's all about heart, once we know how to work with that which we call the irrational, and hence a path with a heart.
You shared with us part of your growing up. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Elizabeth, I was born in Zimbabwe. As I've already said, my father was a gold miner. But when I say a gold miner, he was what was then called a small worker. In other words, he wasn't an employee on one of the big mines, but he worked for himself. He was literally digging gold all by himself. So I very much grew up, as I also already stated, in the wilderness, because you don't find gold mines in the middle of cities.
So in finding your path with the heart, and in your own digging for gold, where did you first hear then of the word or the concept of Toltec? If you were out in the wilderness, how did it actually come to you?
Goodness me. I was already in my mid-20s before I first came across the word Toltec. And I suppose I was absolutely bewitched and bewildered by it, because I'd never heard of Toltec ever in my life before. And in fact, the way I came across it was in the first book, which was written by Dr. Carlos Castaneda. And I first read about, in fact, the word Toltec isn't actually mentioned in that book, but of course, warrior and the warrior's path is mentioned. And I absolutely loved what his benefactor, if you like, his teacher, but I prefer to call him a benefactor, what his benefactor had taught him. Because Juan was his name, Juan Mares, wasn't actually his real name, by the way, but it's the way Carlos called him in the books. But Juan's words to Carlos just rang so true for me, which is why I said I became totally fascinated and bewitched. And I just had to know more. I just had to know what, in fact, why it rang so true for me. And so it was from there that I really started my own studies in terms of what is this warrior's path and what does it actually mean to be Toltec.
So how did you find this book? I mean, did it fall on your head in a bookstore? Or?
Almost. What had happened was I was doing a tour of Europe in 1977. I was on a study tour, as a matter of fact, going from city to city right throughout Europe and England, and also the United States and Canada, studying with various universities and various other institutions of learning. But it was during the summer break when the friend that I was traveling with and myself were having a short break with a relative of his in Switzerland. And this relative happened to have a skiing cottage up near the Alps somewhere. And she invited us to come and spend a weekend with her. Of course, it was summer, so there was no snow. But because she and my friend were relatives, they used to sit around the table and gossip endlessly about, catching up on where all the relatives are at. And I felt completely out and nothing to do. I noticed that she had quite a nice little bookshop. So I asked her if she'd mind if I read one of the books. And I think it was about the first or second book I pulled out, which was the book, which was Carlos Castaneda's first book. And I had no idea what it was about, but I started to read it anyway. And within the first few pages, I was engrossed. I was just sorry they didn't have any more.
And how did finding this book and these teachings affect your life from then onwards?
Well, it was quite an amazing experience, really. Because, to cut a long story short, after that year was finished, I returned to Cape Town, which is where I was then living and working. But by then, I absolutely knew that I'd reached a point which I call an act of survival in my life. I really, really needed to find answers as to what was my life all about. What am I supposed to be doing in this lifetime? I might just add that by that stage, by the time I'd gone overseas, I'd already achieved huge success in terms of my career. And as far as my work was concerned, really I could pick and choose in terms of what I wanted to do in terms of earning a living, because I'd reached what most people see as being success.